Thank you for having me here, first of all. I hope that I can liven up the afternoon for you. I know everyone's maybe a bit sort of lagging now. It's the afternoon session. I can see maybe there's a few more spaces left now, so I'm going to try and keep it as interesting as I can. This is normally a presentation I give to architects, clients and end users. It's not a presentation I've used in this sort of environment before, so I'm going to try and talk through some of the slides and you can help me along the way. That's me. You've said that bit already, so I'll just skip this one. Okay, so what we're going to talk about really was why consider access for maintenance in the concept of sort of buildings or structures, the consequence of poor access. I know you've picked on some of this morning, the hierarchy of access provision, developing strategies, designing buildings for access. So I'm going to just describe that in a bit more detail later in terms of making sure that we can start to work with developers, end users, clients, architects to start thinking about what these buildings are going to be, how we're going to maintain them in the future when they're being designed, rather than, getting a design and then having to adapt everything to that building. I've got some, I typically do have more project examples. I've only got 25 minutes, so I've only got one project in there. And this is a project that was dear to me, which is the Qatar National Museum in Doha. I've also thrown in a few silly photos in there. When we put this presentation out afterwards, I'll take these silly photos out. But why consider access? Well, really, because there's legal requirements on us to do that. And as a designer, me, and maybe other people that are involved in access and designing and specifying systems, they're designers and they've got a duty as a designer to act correctly. But also, you've got other legislation. You've got the principal designer. So in the UK, there's a principal designer. That means that there's responsibility to make sure that things are done properly. And then reputation. We have a reputation. So an end user, a client, an architect, they've got a reputation. If suddenly a building is constructed and we can't maintain or operate that building and it looks grubby straight away, their reputation is not necessarily ruined, but it's not going to do their reputation any good. So the consequences of poor access. So first of all, I don't know why I had this on the side that says autumn on there. The idea was it looked like it was a dirty building and someone had written autumn in the side of it. A few people have said to me, I need to take that photo out. Anyway, buildings might not function properly. So you're going to have things where you can't access things, you can't maintain things properly. Important maintenance actions aren't completed, so you might not be able to access the smoke dampers, the fire detection system, because it's at height inside a building. So remember, we're talking about access for maintenance inside a building at height as well as externally. So buildings become dirty and unpleasant to look at, and eventually you've got higher costs incurred in maintaining that building. But buildings lose their value as well. If you own that building, the last thing you want is a building depreciating in value. So to an end user, a client, a developer that's going to hold on to these buildings, not all developers hold on to the buildings, but it's going to lose value, and that will have an effect. So where should we? You can't read any of that, I'm sorry. Where should we get involved? Well, all the way through a building, it's not just the new building at the beginning, so there's a design period at the beginning, and then there's the development afterwards. A building has a life afterwards. So it's the whole life of a building that we're looking at accessing and maintaining a building. So we, as people involved in the access industry, should be involved in the new building aspect. We should be involved in understanding what goes into a building, how you can maintain it, how can we operate it safely. But also, this equipment has a design life. It's got a design life of 25, 30 years. A building has a design life of a minimum of 60 years. Most buildings now that we're looking at have 120 years design life. So you can actually replace these access systems over the whole life of this building as well. So we need to think about that when we put them in the first place. So if we put a BMU on the top of a tower, can we get the BMU off the tower to put a new one in afterwards? We need to think of all these. They seem quite logical. They seem quite straightforward. But we have to think. We as designers and people involved in the industry need to think about all those aspects. So when do we need access? So typically it's cleaning, inspection, maintenance. Internally, external glazing, maybe it's part of the structure. Maybe we're talking about bridges. Maybe we're talking about other not necessarily buildings, but structures. Maybe wind turbines. And we need to access MEP services as well. So that's generally what we're trying to access when we talk about access for maintenance. Again, kind of repeating itself a little bit, but what we're concerned about, we're really concerned about the aesthetics, what this looks like on the building. So as a developer, as a designer, as a client, we're talking about a new building. What do the aesthetics of this access system have on the building? Is it going to make the building ugly? Can we incorporate it into the building? Can we do it in such a way that's cost effective as well? Can we look at the cost? Can we look at the cost in terms of the cost of the installation and the whole design life cost all the way through the life of that equipment as well? Let's think about the legislation, and let's think about not being prosecuted and doing things wrong as well. Maybe that's not what you should do to access. Just a few silly photos, really. This one's my favourite though, because that actually took some thought to do that, really, I think. But what we don't want is people having to. I guess what I'm trying to say here is, this is an over-exaggerated scenario. But what we don't want is people having to really sort of look. They don't have the correct access systems or provision on a building, so therefore they have to resort to making things up themselves. And so you get this. So typically I talk about sort of the types of access. I'm not going to do that here because I think generally we as a forum here, you're pretty au fait with the different types of access. But I will quickly go through. This is a really useful slide. This is taken from a Syria document. I always find this useful. There's loads of other documents that you can use that are very similar. But if you're comparing the different types of access systems, this is a good starter. And it gives you some guidance on sort of the frequency of the work duration so that you're selecting the right type of equipment. So you're not going to use a scaffold for something that needs to be up all the time. And you're not going to use abseiling for something that needs to be up all the time as well. So you're going to look at systems that are relatively, that they're going to suit the duration and the class of work. The hierarchy of access provision. So I know you've talked about this morning, so I won't go over it too much, but this is key to everything we do. So if we're a designer and we're looking at the hierarchy of access control, we are always going to try to look at ways in which we can avoid working at height. So, we're all out of a job. We just design it out and none of us are needed. It's quite simple. But that's never the case. So we need to look at ways in which we can make a safe place of work, we can prevent falls, or at the worst case, we can minimize those falls. So we're looking at avoiding, preventing, and minimizing as much as possible. So if we talk about the level 4, avoiding, I call it level 4, but, so can we design out access? If we're talking about an external facade, can we add opening windows to a facade? Now, that's not always possible, but in some instances, in residential blocks, it is possible that we can have, they've got small windows on some residential blocks. It is possible that you can minimize the amount of access that needs externally by making sure you've got openable windows. Brilliant. We've avoided access at height. We now don't need to deploy someone off the side of this building to clean the window outside. We've avoided it altogether. Now, that sounds really simple, and we should basically all make all windows opening inside. That would be the solution. It's not that simple, obviously, and sorry, there are lots of different buildings that have glazing panels underneath or facade panels underneath, or an external facade that needs, to maintain the warranty on most facade installations, you need to be able to inspect that every 12 months. So you'd need to be designing a building that's maybe brick or something like that doesn't need that kind of external access as well. So it's really simple to say, let's have openable windows. But we need to consider that first. So if we're talking about everything, can we locate the plant and services so we can reach it? No, there's no point putting air-handling equipment on the roof if we can play really hard with the architect, with the client, and say, no, well, this needs to be at ground level. We don't want to put generators up at the roof. We want to put generators at the ground floor so that when they break, they can be taken out really easily. We don't want to crane them off the roof. We don't want people working at height. We don't want that crane. So can we I apologise for my cough. Can we eliminate the need to work at height altogether? So for instance, in stadiums, where there's lighting rigs, you can often lower that lighting down to ground level. You don't need to get a mute to go up at high level. You can lower lighting down in some instances, not in all, not suitable for all scenarios, but we should consider all these things first. Can we reduce the amount of glazing at high level in a building? Now this is the most controversial one because clearly an architect won't want to be doing this. An architect doesn't design a square box, because that would be boring. They're designing buildings that have different curves, different elevations, different facades that lean in and articulate, different colors. They're complicated facades and buildings. So this is a really difficult one to sell to an architect. But actually, sometimes it's not. If you can consider with an architect different materials. So on one particular project we had, there was a tower, and at the very top of this tower was all the plant, but it was all glazing. Well, why did that need to be glazing? This is a plant area. There's no one looking out the windows. Can we make this a facade, a mesh facade or something? So we worked with the architect and say, well, look, we're going to redesign the top part of this building, the top 4 floors, and we're going to take the glazing out, and we're going to put something in that looks very similar to glazing. From the ground, you won't notice the difference. But actually, you probably only need to clean it maybe once every 3 years, rather than all the time. If you're cleaning an external facade of a building, you're going to do that maybe 4 times a year if you're doing it properly. So you reduce that frequency quite dramatically by looking at using other materials or reducing glazing wherever possible. Can we use balconies? So in certainly in residential, it may be that we can have maybe a small Juliet balcony or a proper balcony, and then the resident that owns that block can actually clean that glazing themselves, and it's quite simple to do that. If it's a single height of glazing, there's no reason why anyone in their own apartment shouldn't be able to clean their own glazing if it's a single story. And then maybe simple things like cleaning from the ground, so water-fed poles, extendable poles. What can we do from the ground? So we're cleaning from the ground. So those are the sort of things that we should, as designers, be really focusing on first of all, before we then say, well, no, actually, that works for some of the building, but it doesn't work for all of the building. So we need to consider other access means now. So we then think about what can we do to put someone in a safe place of work. So they might need to go on the roof. We're going to put handrails on. We're going to provide collective measures. We're going to do everything we can to provide someone with a safe place of work. If we can't do that, we're then trying to prevent falls. We're trying to put someone maybe with a restraint system on the roof. There's no handrail anymore because the architect won't allow us to put handrail on there, or because there's some planning issues. We've had buildings where there's been planning issues. We haven't been able to put handrails on there, quite controversially, which I think is maybe something for another topic. But so we're prevented maybe by a heritage status or something from putting a handrail to making it safe on that roof. But we can prevent the falls by making sure that someone's on a line that doesn't mean they can get to a fall situation. And then if we can't do that, we have to minimise the consequences of a fall. So we might be putting fall restraint systems on or something of that nature. So that's the sort of design criteria that we'd go through. Designing buildings for access. So this is my key point today about designing buildings for access, turning access on its head. So at an early stage, we, as either designers or an industry, have to be involved at the design of a building. We can no longer get to a situation where a building is almost complete and you get a phone call to say, oh, can you install a BMU for me? Can you put a cable system on this roof? I can just access this with a MUBE, and you clearly can't on a building in certain areas, maybe because they've got trees there and they think, well, I can just use a MUBE. So we have to be involved at an early stage so that we can start designing buildings suitable for access. And there's benefits to that because we can then start looking at the revenue costs of that of the building as we go through the whole life cycle as well. So if we're looking at the building form from a concept, we can make subtle changes in the form of the building that are going to make massive changes to the amount of cleaning, maintenance and access over that life of the building. So a small change like, moving one window to a different location or changing the material can make a big change to the cost of a building, the revenue cost of a building through its design life. Ensuring there's enough space on the roof for plant materials or BMUs or access equipment. And we can also influence space planning to make sure there's enough mechanical plant in there for future replacement. But also, we need to think about whole life cycle costs. So buildings typically, as I said, have 60 to 100 years design life. So a small little investment, capital cost, can make a big difference. So, as I said here, if we spend an additional £1 in capital investment in a construction, then an estimate is that over the life of the building, you would save £10 to £100 in maintenance of a building. Now that's a massive cost. But obviously not everyone's interested in that because sometimes a building might be constructed just to be flipped. By flipped, I mean you've got a developer that's not going to run and maintain that building themselves afterwards. It's going to be moved on or it's sold to individuals and there maybe is an interest afterwards. But where there is an interest, something like that is a really key driver to making sure that we consider access properly. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to go even quicker. I'm just going to flip through a few of these slides. So typically, just showing how we would typically sort of design and develop strategies, what we use. We try where possible to use 3D models and BIM and so forth. And that might be in the form of a sketchbook, reports, but specifications are important as well, because if you don't specify the equipment at the end, then you're going to lose completely. Right, so I've got about 6 minutes left. So the Qatar National Museum. So this was a project I've worked on for nearly 10 years. It was opened in March 2019, and it was a Jean Nouveau project. So this is the architect that designed the Louvre, and he was commissioned to design a museum piece that the building would look like, not an attraction, but the building has an influence. It's a piece of art as well. So as you can see from these images, it's just opened. This was the first project sort of 10, 11 years ago that we didn't use any 2D drawings for this building at all. And that was really because they wouldn't have been any use. We didn't know where the floor levels were. Everything was different. Some of the floors were sloping in the building. Really complicated, really complicated. But we had lots of issues to look at. The first of all was there was a main road that ran right in front of it. So that gave us some constraints. It's a seafront location, so we're going to get lots of issues with build-up of residue and so forth from the seawater. And then it's a sandy and rainy location as well. So you don't get much rain in the Middle East, but when you do, it rains, and you get this build-up of sand. And then also you can see here there's a heritage building right in the middle of the site, and obviously that's got to be kept. So a few constraints to think about first of all. So first of all, we thought was how can we start reducing the access frequency on this basis, on this building? It's absolutely enormous. We need to, if we have to clean this building, the roof, the architect was adamant this building was going to be white. You're going to be cleaning it with 10, 20 people constantly. They're going to interabseil it because all the angles are massively high on the roof. We can't do that. So we had many early discussions with the architect about changing the colour, and eventually we won, and they changed the colour to a sort of sandy grey colour. So you can see that it's not quite white, but it's not It's kind of got the sand effect. So what we were looking at was that when we get that sand, we don't want a group of people have to go out there immediately and clean it. We don't want people cleaning the building continually. We want sand to form on the building. We want little streaks on the facade, and that's going to be acceptable because that's going to meld in with what the look of the building is and the colour of the building. So great, we've done something. So we've probably saved about £2 million in terms of the maintenance over the life of that building by reducing probably the access frequency from continuous to maybe once a year or twice a year, maybe with 10, maybe a team of 10 people. So that's a great saving, first of all. So how can we make the roof safer as well? So we've got all these discs, and all these discs were sort of 60 degrees, 40 degrees. So we sat down with the architect and we worked out a plan where 85% of the building could be accessed by making all these discs back at 15 degrees. If we can make them back at 15 degrees, we can put regular cable access systems on there. It's going to make access a lot more safe. We know we can't do that everywhere, so you can see there's a number of abseiling points on the building anyway, but what we enable everyone to do is walk around this building, get to the lightning protection points, get to the places where the water gathers in the gutters and the crease of the roof, and we can maintain that building. So that's great. So that's a success. So another tick to us. How can we access the outside? So this is some really early images of when this was like nearly 10 years ago. We thought, right, well, we need to look at where the mute paths are around the building. So you start looking at that in terms of, right, can we move those trees? We need access to the facade in these locations. And then how to access the inside. That was probably the most complex because we had all the glazing that sort of leans in at an angle. Some of it leans out. Some of it was so low you couldn't even stand up in it. So you can see down here, you couldn't even stand up in some of this. So we worked with the architect to try and design this out as much as possible. But we didn't completely succeed on this. We did a schedule of all the glazing and we got to a situation where we had, I think it was something like 97% of all the glazing you could access, you could remove it. And there's still some problematic glazing in this project. So if you ever get called there, don't look at the 3% because you're not going to get it out. We also look at storage. So can we store things correctly? Have we got enough space in a building as well? We have to think about the basics as well. There's no point designing a building if you haven't got any space for your cleaning equipment, your access equipment. You need to make sure that's in there as well. 2 more photos, some really bad examples of access. And that was the end of my presentation.